Last year's president of the Ottawa Historical Association of the OHA. And so I'm here to say that I'm thrilled that we're here meeting at the Ottawa Art Gallery and that we're kicking off our 6th speaker series. And particularly I'm here because I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Dominique Marshall. But before I do, I'll just remind you that we're going to meet right here for the whole season, all 6. And our next meeting is on Tuesday, November 12th. It's Marie-Dominique Asselin, and she's speaking on, she's from U of O, Justice as Witness, New Perspectives on Jewish-Polish Relations During the German Occupation. She works with Jan Brodowski at the University of Ottawa. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And then on Tuesday, December 10th, we have Shirley Tillotson. She's coming in from out of town, and she's going to be talking about her award-winning research on Canada's tax policy history. So that will be great as well. So we also invite you after Dominique speaks for about 45 minutes, and we'll have some questions that will, here we have an attached place to have a drink and continue the conversation. So a bunch of us may do that, and please join us for that. And also we have Hubert, who is live streaming what we're doing. So if you are asking a question and you're not comfortable with being on social media, please let us know. We will make sure that you can ask your question in a way that you're comfortable with. So tonight I have the honor of introducing our very first speaker, Professor Dominique Marshall, as both tonight's speaker and as the incoming president of the organization. So it's a bit of a tradition to have the president do one of the talks. So tonight is also the presidential address for the OHA. So as I say, she'll speak for about 45 minutes. There will be a facilitated time for questions, and then hopefully those who are interested can continue the conversation over a coffee and a dessert. So to do a more focused introduction of tonight's speaker, Dominique is the just outgoing chair of the Department of History at Carleton University and a recent president of the CHA, Canadian Historical Association. I cite these kind of two as examples of the fact that she's also kind of a driving force, maybe a creator of community amongst the historical community of historians in Canada. Dominique studies the history of humanitarian aid and human rights, and in particular, as these have developed, some of the publications in Canada, but largely transnationally. Her recent publications focus in particular on children's rights, and transnationally the demand for organization and institutionalization of humanitarian aid to children and children's rights. And so it's in this area that we're lucky enough to hear her speak tonight. She's going to speak 1919, A Revolution in Children's Rights, Andrée Colin and the Divided Loyalties of the Secretariat of the League of Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're not live streaming, we're just recording this.
Oh, cool.
Don't worry. And then, but then we will post the recording on the website of certainly the Canadian Network of Humanitarian History, but maybe the OHA. And it's for the question time, that if you don't want your question to be on tape, we can edit it out and just have my answer or something. Okay, Andrée Colin was 40 years old in 1924 when she moved from Brussels to Geneva to become part of the social section of the League of Nations Secretariat. She joined the British veteran of war relief, Rachel Proudie, and the French social worker and niece of a high Catholic hierarchy member in France, Léonie Chaptal. She outlasted them both in the Palace of Nations, remaining there for 17 years. Her departure in 1941 from Secretariat, diminished by the outset of the war it had aimed to prevent, occurred amongst rumors of financial malversations and scandal. She died shortly after, a few months after, in 1941. The biography of Colin, which I'm just starting to explore because the personal files of her at the League of Nations archives have been opened only recently, is contradictory. She can be seen as a promoter and also as a slowing down person in the revolution of children's rights that had been unleashed by the Great War. As a woman, a Belgian, a Catholic, a charity worker, a middle-class person, a French-speaking person, she did not fit the regular pattern of most of the League's bureaucracy. Her work, and the work of those around her, helps put in perspective the meaning of the rights of the child as they were understood then, to uncover the tensions behind the apparently simple language of the first Declaration of the Rights of the Child in 1924. In doing so, the study of her biography provides keys to understand the promises and the dilemmas of the uses of children's rights today, 100 years after the first projects of universal declarations of the rights of the child were drafted, and 3 declarations later, one in 1924, one in 1959 at the United Nations, and a convention in 1989. So I have 15 slides over 45 minutes to give you an overview of what I think her life and her work and the work around her tells us about the rights of the child and what lessons can be learned from these debates to understand children's rights today. In 1924, the arrival of this Belgian, French-speaking and Catholic colleague, together with many of her files, was part of a settlement between British international bureaucrats and the beleaguered counterparts in Brussels, who had lost their decade-long campaign for Brussels to become the center of social welfare diplomacy in the world. From the offices of the International Association for the Protection of Child Welfare, l'Office international de la protection de l'enfance, where she had been working for years in Brussels, in the Secretariat of the organization, she had overseen, Colin, meetings about child welfare for 2 decades, under the skeptical eyes of the very British high civil servants who were now presiding over her transfer from Brussels to Geneva. It was the contentious result of the request for relief agencies concerned with children in countries devastated by war, and from Belgian associations of child welfare that were kind of absorbed by British assumptions of control. And so now it could assume the color of universality. But really the British high civil servants of the Foreign Office did not want anything to do with these children. But they didn't want also to have Brussels start something which they could not oversee. So to have this lady who was the main bureaucrat of the Brussels office of this more charitable international organization was a compromise. She embodied that compromise. Article 24 and 25 of the League of Nations Covenant 100 years ago had said that any existing international endeavor in social affairs should come to Geneva, and any new one should be protected and overseen by Geneva and the League's institutions. So between 1919 and 24, when she moved, there was 5 years of high diplomacy to say, what do we do with that stuff? You know, could we stop it? Is it bound to be bigger? If so, should it come over? And really the British and the British did their best to control it, but they could not do without the Belgians, and they couldn't do without the French. So there you go. We arrive in 1924. And this is Sir Eric Drummond, the first General Secretary of the League. Is pictured there in 1926. He's the main orchestrator of that move and the main person who wished to really bring these people over, but keep them quiet enough, but at the same time allow this movement in favor of children and the protection and the international protection of child welfare, which came out of the war, to thrive in some ways that could be overseen by the League. So the fact that Colin was Belgian is very important. Belgium, as you know, was neutral during the war. It was invaded by Germany, who asked for passage to France, and the fate of that neutral country, which was as populated as Canada at the time, which was the world most crowded country in the world, and which fancied itself, for good reason, as the center of liberal social welfare thinking, that the fact that she came from there was not fortuitous. And this Belgium, seen as a liberal haven, had convinced many over the world that they were important. So the protection of the Belgian child had mobilized. It was the cause before the Americans entered the war. It was the largest cause of mobilization of American civilians for money donation and time spent by volunteers. So the American social workers who gravitated around the newly founded league, even if the Americans were not in the league, the social workers were close to the social sections of the league and they could participate in the activities of the Secretariat, believed that Belgium was really not the place where this should happen. The British didn't, like Drummond didn't, but Eric Drummond understood at the time that there existed a general sympathy felt with Belgium, I'm quoting him, amongst nations and welfare agencies. The large movement of support for Belgian children during the occupation of Germany during the war had attracted enough sympathy in allied country to make it, and I quote him again, difficult up till now to combat effectively this tendency. He didn't like it, he wanted to fight it, but he couldn't. Anxious to keep British control over the European relations, he had no choice. So he said that, and he understood that the object, and I quote him, is one philanthropically so worthy of support that if other powers are willing, we ought not perhaps to stand out on such utilitarian ground as these only. Okay, and so there you go. This is an advert that was made in Montreal for a Belgian relief levy. So even in Americans were especially sympathetic because they were neutral as well, but Canadians were, and the plight of Belgian children gathered a lot of money, and a lot of it because of the Belgian community of Canada. So there were days and parades and school campaigns. And here is also the monthly journal of the International Association of the Protection of Child Welfare that Colin oversaw. And a lot of the money which was raised in Canada and in the States went to charities that were related to that group. And there was a very hierarchical thing where richer kids were distributing the money to lower kids in Belgium. So it was not all kids are equal. It was rich kids in Canada giving money to rich kids, or rich charities in Belgium who were happy to give their money to poorer kids in Belgium. So it was a very aristocratic-like way of doing charity, even if they spoke of themselves as a liberal place. It's also interesting that after the war mobilization of World War I and the extraordinary support of a lot of civilians for children in neutral zones, in allied zones, but also in enemy zones, that took a lot of people by surprise. And it happened all at once. So you can see what happened between 1919 and 1939 almost as a way to unpack the reasons why that popularity was so strong during the war. They did not really know what had happened to them, but they knew that something was happening around the child. And now the war was over, so the question was, what do we do with all that enthusiasm? And is there a way to keep people going and work together the way they were during wartime around children? And that was a lot of the questions of 1919. And so post-war reconstruction kept them going for a while. But after that is when people thought, we're going to talk about entitlements for childhood, a minimum for childhood. And they were hoping that these tropes and these slogans would gather as much volunteer energy and as much funds as the campaigns in favor of the child during the war. So this Spanish fellow, Spanish muralist painter, José María Serre, was asked in the mid-30s to do all the murals around the new General Assembly room of the new Palace of Nations. So this is the new Palace of Nations. So the first 1924, when Colin arrives, they are in the Palais Wilson, closer to the river, but then everybody moves up the hill in the palace in the mid-30s. This is the General Assembly room, which looks towards the river, and the murals that José Serre painted. He painted also some in some annexes. I'll show you that later. And this mural is here, just here, and this is him painting it. And according to the art historians who have written the little thing that you read when you visit the Palace of Nations, this was one of the most successful murals. And I put it there, it's called Peace, because of the kid there. Because I wanted to show you how central the image of a child is for, the symbol of the child had become for the idea of peace. There was a lot of hopes around that symbol. So in the New York Times, for instance, in exactly then around 1924, around the arrival of Colin, there were people to write, the children of the world will be under the protection of the League of Nations. Within the League of Nations, all the children of the world will be protected, and this is the best guarantor of peace. And the Canadian delegates at the League, many of them believe that that kind of international humanitarian work was what mobilized Canadians the most. That was what made the League interesting to Canadians more than anything else. Not these non-aggression things, the humanitarian work in favor, in particular, of children. I'm going to read you what the art historian says about this hope part of the mural of José Serre. This is the representation of the victory of man over the scourges of the world, the genius of man at the service of his faith in a better world. And it shows the mobilized soldiers returning home, weary but blissful, welcomed by their mothers, their wives, and their children, who would forget the terrors of the past and use the now discarded cannons as their playthings. Once again, man will live in peace. And so there, the link with Colin, I think I just want to say that before I shift, is that as this kind of peaceful, neutral place, which really became the focus of humanitarian aid towards children, she had a claim to that kind of association more than other people from other nationalities. Okay, so when she arrived, the organization of a Child Welfare Committee of the League was in place. She was part of the deal. It was annexed to another thing, which was the Committee Against the Traffic of Women and Children, which had been absorbed by the League from its beginning, and another committee of opium, regulation of opium, which had been there since the beginning. So these three things became the social section of the League, but the Child Welfare Committee had its own thing, a very small office, but it was its own thing. And at the same time, the same NGOs, the same charities that had been fighting for this to happen, had been drafting conventions, declarations of the right of the child since the end of the war. So you had women's organizations, you had welfare organizations, and you had the Save the Children Fund, which had been created at the very end of the war to help starving children in Vienna. And after years of drafting and redrafting, it's their draft that won. And it won because it was simple, it was easy to remember for children, and it was also British, right? That did not hurt. So this is the League of Nations General Assembly in the Palais Wilson before the Palace of Nations was built. This is the initial declaration signed by everyone. It was adopted unanimously, and it was the first Universal Declaration of Rights. This is before the one against slavery. It's the first. It's a real first, and it's not a chance that it's around children. And this is the sign of the Save the Children International Union. And this is the constitutive assembly of the International Union, the Save the Children International Union, which really drove that thing to happen. So this, I think that's all I need to say at the moment, that part. Right. So there she is, and I don't know, I'll talk to you about this, if it's this lady or this lady. That tells you about how anonymous women were in the League of Nations Secretariat. I'm still guessing who she is. This is Rachel Proudy, the lady, the British person who was important in Armenian relief in London, who was very involved in field hospitals in France during the war. And this is the fellow in charge of the opium section of the social section. And this is the organization of the League. And I showed it to you because that thing is very little compared to all the League organization. So my argument that it was a bit of an afterthought and it was pushed in because of diplomacy in Europe is was supported by how little that office was. But my other argument is however little, it was bearing a lot of the hopes and a lot of interesting trends for the future. I think, what do I want to say? So, okay, so the way it worked is that Secretariat of the social, that part of the Secretariat devoted to social affairs was running all year long. But every fall, you would have a meeting of the Committee of Child Welfare. And that was a few weeks affair to which was attended by our very own Charlotte Whitten 2 times. And where some members were elected or appointed by the General Assembly, and Charlotte Whitten had to do a lot of diplomacy to get there. And otherwise, there was a commission of the General Assembly of the League, which was devoted to social questions, where questions of child welfare would have to go to be adopted or to be presented to the General Assembly. And there was also the council through which a lot of diplomacy could be done. So this is like the bureaucracy, which is there all year long, and then there is the occasional meeting of the commissions, which meet at the same time as the General Assembly, and the committees, which are linked to the Secretariat. So there's 4 different kinds of things talking to each other. And one of the reasons Canada became important in the Committee on Child Welfare is because the Americans had no seat at the General Assembly, and they had no seat at the Social Commission of the General Assembly. So Whitten, and who had some connection, who came to Geneva and knew the people who were at the General Assembly and at the Social Commission, could convey the American wishes. So she had a lot of power in the committee where there were some Americans. She was gathering all the stuff and bringing it to the Canadians at the General Assembly, where the Americans could not sit. So for a while, Canada, like they did at the beginning of World War I and at the beginning of World War II for the rest of the diplomacy, in child welfare diplomacy, had tons of power because they were the conduit of American wishes and American social work ideas. They also, the Americans, financed a lot of the Child Welfare Committee activities. And so it was funny that actually that's how they could have some kind of presence in the League in many ways. So they gave some money. They also influenced a lot of the topics of reflection of the committee. So nutrition became very important. So that committee, together with the health organization, had a joint committee, which is the committee that really put together the first reports on vitamins and the importance of vitamins for child welfare. They did a lot of work on dependent children, the juvenile delinquents, the orphans, and the systems of foster care and the systems of orphanages all over the Western world. They did a bit of work on some scandals, the way that young girls were treated in Japan, They had a few emergency things to do like this. But that's really what mobilized the work of that committee. Okay, I wanted to say also that Andrée Colin was a woman, and women at the League of Nations is a whole topic, and Andrew Johnston, my colleague, is better than me at that one, but I'll try not to disappoint him. So to illustrate this, before I go back to Colin, Agnes, so I told you women's organizations were very important in pushing for a declaration of the rights of the child. Women, children, that was, maternal feminism. It was an easy one to do, and they were indeed, in all sorts of ways, very important. Although people like Raoul Dandurand, the French-Canadian guy who was the president of the General Assembly for 2 years, I think, in the early 20s, Dandurand had been the father of juvenile delinquency laws in Canada, right? So it's not only women that were taking care of children, but they were very important, and actually women were quite important in all these commissions, committees, and as we've seen in the Secretariat. Having said that, Agnes MacPhail, who is here, and that's just a close-up on here, she went on the disarmament committee. So she came, she was the women MP in Ottawa, famously the first one, and they brought her in their delegation when the Canadians went to the League that year, and she explicitly said, I'm not going to the social committee. This is a ghetto for women, I'm going on disarmament. And she was famously against cadets and against the involvement of young kids and youth in branches of the army. And it's interesting that, again, that the idea of involving children in war indirectly through the cadets is something she opposed dearly. But the involvement of children in warlike activities was also very important to mobilize people in favor of children's rights. So these are contradictory forces that met in Geneva. So the League for Women was in general very important. The Secretariat of the League employed women doing jobs that very often they could not or had problems doing at home, like Mary McGeechee, the Canadian whose biography has been written a few years ago. Now, after that, she went to work for the United Nations Rehabilitation and Relief Agency. Mary McGeechee was librarian for a long time. She came through the YWCA, and she was her job was very important, but at the same time, she met a ceiling. You could not rise as high as the men at the League. So, in general, it's seen as a step forward for women's employment, but at the same time, there were limits to what they could do. And it was the same for Colin, and the fact that I still cannot know who on earth she is on that picture tells you a lot. I know all the guys on the picture, but I have a hard time finding who she is. It's going to be solved shortly, but at the moment I can't.